NYCTV presents About the Arts with Barbara Lee Diamondstein.
Welcome to About the Arts. I'm Barbara Lee Diamondstein, and our guest today is Charlotte Curtis, who is at present the editor of that important page in the New York Times known as the op-ed page. She is, ironically, however, better known for what I dare say she considers her less consequential activity as a sometime reporter of the social scene. In that role in the history of American journalism, she's responsible for converting cocktail party drivel into modern, readable, journalistic sociology. A collection of some of her reporting has recently been published under the title The Rich and Other Atrocities. In that quite remarkable, readable, and informative book, you've said that money is still in style, especially if it's inherited. What does that title mean, The Rich and Other Atrocities? Is there a line in the book that refers to it?
No, there isn't a line in the book. It derives from the first women's movement demonstration in Atlantic City against the Miss America contest, when women threw high heel shoes in a barrel and bras and all kinds of things like hair curlers that represented our enslavement. And my favorite was the woman who came by with a box of soap flakes and threw it in and shouted, "And down with the atrocity of washing dishes." And I think these are the kinds of atrocities we're talking about.
How did a nice girl like you become a society reporter?
That's a very good question. I sort of fell into it sideways. You know, Clifton Daniel actually asked me to do it for the New York Times in 1963 to cover society, and at the time I wasn't wildly enthusiastic, but he said, you know, let's do it in the way that the Times would do it. Let's do it thoroughly, let's do it carefully. And so that's what we did.
What's happened to society reporting in the last 5 years? Is it different than when you started reporting?
Well, I think it changed a lot in the 60s, more importantly. I think women's pages changed, among other things. They had been ghettos for things that really were old-fashioned and out of date. I mean, brides were all beautiful, and we were busy telling people how to dress and what they ought to look like. And I think the serious questions of journalism and news came in the 60s. We began to cover the fashion world, society, whatever, with the same principles we covered fires, the same principles we covered robberies, all the kinds of things that were news. We tried to instill the same principles of coverage instead of this white-gloved approach that had been previously. And I think that's where the biggest change was. I mean, the changes were then, and now there is still an awful lot of adoration in society columns of one sort or another. I mean, a kind of you know, a fawning. But I don't think it's quite as bad as it used to be.
With all the important, earth-shaking topics within your purview as editor of the op-ed page, why do you still go back at every opportunity to reporting the social scene? I noticed last week and this week and now the beginning of a new column that we all look forward to eagerly called New Yorkers, etc. What keeps on luring you, almost like the moth and the flame, to that part of the paper?
That's a very good question. But let's say this, the question of who's going to be the next Secretary of State, or whether or not we're going to have a nuclear arms treaty agreement, what's going to happen in South Africa, what's happening in Beirut, all of these things are terribly important. The economics, are we going to have unemployment? Are we going to emphasize the question of inflation versus unemployment? Very important. But who says in this world that we can't have some fun? And just because you can understand Keynesian economics doesn't mean that you can't understand when somebody picks up a teacup. I find when people ask me this question, in some ways, and not you, I really don't mean you, Barbara, but they're really being very snobbish. So what they're saying is, now that you're this lady editor, why would you, you know, grovel around with dirty reporters? And what I am answering is not only that all subjects are interesting as a reporter, but I'm saying that I really am a reporter. The fact that I do the op-ed page as an editor, that's not the important thing about what I do. What I do is as a reporter, and a reporter doesn't necessarily go to the typewriter.
It seems to me you have the best of both worlds. And what is the new column, New Yorkers, etc.? How often will it appear, and what is its focus?
Well, it'll run every week with any luck. I say that because it's going to be a very difficult task to do while simultaneously doing 12 other things, and with the now lure of the inauguration coming up in the first 100 days of this Carter administration, because I will not be able not to go and do something about it. But with any luck at all, it is going to be pieces of reporting having to do with what's going on in New York City. And the beauty of the et cetera, obviously, is that means I can go to China.
Tomorrow the world.
Yes. But it's really not going to be a column. I think that's a misnomer. I mean, it is an understandable misnomer because the title, New Yorkers, et cetera, sits there. But I see it as a place where it's going to have all kinds of stories.
One of the liveliest topics of concern and speculation, not only in this town but all around the country and the world these days, is the Carter administration. Obviously, you have a point of view, too, and you're going to make it clearly known in terms of the inauguration and the first 100 days, if you can confine yourself to that period. What do you think of the Jacksonian plans for the inauguration?
I think they're going to be fun. I mean, Andrew Jackson opened up the White House and invited everybody in, and it did tear up the place and really did quite a lot of damage to the White House. But people had a good time, in addition to everything else, and it was a populist presidency. And it did some very important things in pushing the country forward. Now, I don't think for 1 minute that when and if Mr. Carter should open the White House, that it will leave it damaged when all these people come tromping through. I don't think that will happen. There will be a Jacksonian quality about it in the sense that it is a populist. I think it will be a partly populist administration. But I think this is good. There'll be openness, informality, generosity. Folksy is a word that comes to mind easily because of Plains, Georgia. And it's going to be criticized because it isn't going to be formal enough to suit people's taste. But where is it written that the White House has to be formal?
And as a long-term square dancer, I'm in favor of that. What do you see as the cultural effect on the rest of the country for the tenor and aura that this new White House will create?
That's a very difficult question because, of course, one of the basic things in all administrations specifically is what is the administration going to do for the arts? Is it going to give actual support? Is it going to give lip service? And this is one of the areas in which the Carters, as I'm sure you know, are really not very well expressed. They did very well with the public support by going to the opera and various cultural events in Georgia. But that's not the same as seeing that there are federal funds for some arts projects. We have no promise of any such federal funding that I know of in this administration.
I really meant in the larger cultural sense, but I think more and more that the cultural life of this country may be the one area that is beyond partisan dispute. It's an idea whose time has come and with a developed constituency out there. Sure. You mentioned earlier that you think that the White House will have a folksy quality. What is an aristocrat? Is there such a thing as a real American aristocrat?
I think so. Yes, it's somebody whose family has been here for a long time, and somewhere along the line somebody made a lot of money. Let's hope that that money was made morally, legally.
But if enough time lapses, it's a dimension of,
yes, and
laundering it.
With that money, such people have attempted to make a better community over a period of generations, more than 3 generations, perhaps, where they've been involved in a community and where they've left marks that are visible, known, and important in moving the community forward. And I think there are such people, particularly in Boston, certainly in New York, also in San Francisco, yes, and of course all through the South.
Well, obviously there are regional differences in taste. Do you think there are regional differences in taste?
Oh, sure.
Is the West Coast more eccentric, the East more knowing? And what do you make of the Southern Rim? Are they experimental? Are they our new status symbol?
Well, that's all right. Let's start with the Southern Rim. I think the Southern Rim is the most classical part of the country, more close to its roots, more close to America's past in some ways. which is funny because obviously New England thinks of itself as being the oldest part of the country.
Unless you've lived or spent a great deal of time in the South, and
Yeah.
they know.
No, they really, there is something there that happens there. But I don't think it's crazy or kooky just because it's Californian. And also, I think there's a very strong division between Northern California and Southern California.
Locale.
Yeah.
What are the current status symbols? Will a Southern accent be in?
Oh, you know it, y'all.
I'm practicing too. Well, what is, in fact, I was going to say what's in and what's out, but better than that, I should ask what happened to what's in and what's out.
Oh, that's very good. Well, the question is, I mean, you have to say this facetiously, I hope, but has anything been in Washington now for the last X years? I mean, when was the last time anything in Washington was in? With the possible exception of the Georgetown circuit, which makes the decisions as to what's in and is out, and therefore obviously is in, because it defines itself as in. But I'm not so sure that I don't think that the definitions aren't in the eye of the beholder, and if you don't think it's in, or I don't think it's in...
Then it can't be.
Well, it isn't that it can't be, but it isn't for us, and therefore,
Yes.
I mean, it's, you know, who cares?
Well, what are the current status symbols?
You mean aside from a Southern accent?
Yes.
Work. Hard work.
For
Jimmy
women to...
Carter works. Rosalind Carter works. You got to work and roll up your sleeves. It's going to be very Puritan. I suppose that there's a certain... well, I don't know what's going to happen to piety. The question suddenly comes to my mind, my goodness, do you suppose we're going to have a return to piety? God may come back. Although I really think he came back in the early 70s.
There is a symbolic relationship that you touch on in your book, The Rich and Other Atrocities. And you talk about the symbiotic relationship between the press and disposable celebrities. Society, you mentioned, is as transient and fickle, I guess, is the latest invitation, if I recall what you said. In order to report well the social scene, it seems that it is necessary to blend imperceptibly into it. How do you avoid, if you do, becoming a part of it?
Well, I think it's very easy for a reporter, that is on television too, because with the camera it's quite obvious who you are. But it also is obvious for a reporter with a notebook. And I think that's what you do. I mean, you declare who you are. The obvious question is, how much does it nibble away at the edges over the years? And that I can't say, but if you believe in objectivity as a goal, sometimes it works.
How did you find making the transition from the beautiful people and the not so beautiful people to the more substantive issues of the op-ed page?
Well, you know, I'd always been
How'd that
interested in
happen?
those. Yeah, but I think more importantly that while I was covering the rich and other atrocities, I was also paying attention to what was happening in Vietnam, what was happening in Watergate, what was happening everywhere else in the world. Among other things, I was reading the New York Times. You cannot be badly informed if you read all of the New York Times. So that it really wasn't that much of a transition for me. Well, the transition is only as a reporter, where I'd been to a certain extent penned, if you will, or kept in, by choice, I might add. I mean, it's what I wanted to do. Now the whole world is open to me. And it really wasn't much of a transition because it was just letting me do what I was already interested in, pursue things I was already interested in. The one thing that was very difficult in that transition, and I went back and spent a year studying economics because I really had to bone up to understand the economics laws.
What's your mandate on the op-ed page?
I'm not sure what that means. That's awfully highfalutin.
What's the purpose of the
I
op-ed
know.
page?
I think most importantly it is to bring as many kinds of varieties of ideas within the New York Times as possible, to create 360 degrees of ideas. In other words, not just the left and right of a political issue, but the whole spectrum of a political issue, an economic issue. I think it's also a way of creating access. I think one of the important things is for people who are not on the New York Times to have a say with the kind of circulation we have to get to other people. particularly people who want to redress some kind of grievance within the community, perhaps, that is maybe not a news story, and really you wouldn't cover as a news story. It's also a place to talk about people's lives, for people to write about their own experiences, I mean, to a certain extent, because we are a very mixed bag society, and this gives us a chance to find out about one another. And then it's also a place for original ideas. And you know, if we have 1 or 2 original ideas a year, really original ideas, we're delighted. But that's what we would like to stimulate.
Sometimes the op-ed page itself makes news with those original ideas. What are some of the most striking ones that have occurred during the last year or two? Or the most controversial?
Well, one of the most interesting was actually in Harrison Salisbury's day. A father of a young man who was protesting the war said wrote that he didn't care if his son was dead because of his son's, according to his own lights, his son's disloyalty to the country. Mm-hmm. And that evoked more response perhaps than anything we've ever carried on the op-ed page.
I can recall a hoax, too, and that created quite...
Oh, that was charming. Yes, that was quite charming.
You've had a return of that fellow, too.
We had him back.
What was that about?
Well, he wrote us letters purporting to be a 9 or 10-year-old child who wrote to a long list of celebrities and then got their letters back from them, mostly political people. But the 9-year-old turned out to be somewhere in his 30s and a Wall Street lawyer. We invited him back this year to write in his 9-year-old, quote, nephew, or whatever it was that he called him, to look at the convention, and he did really very nice things for us.
In your book, The Rich and Other Atrocities, you've called them the smart set, the jet set, international nomads, the beautiful people, call them what you will. You describe them as people who help create public taste while simultaneously serving as role models in a world that has always admired the rich and tried to emulate them. Does that still hold true?
I'm afraid so. Yes, I think so.
Who are our role models now?
Well, you know, we have to say we have marvelous Gloria Steinem as a role model. And we have a lot of very positive people as role models.
What names really matter?
Socially today, not many as compared to the past, I think. Not nearly as many.
Is it achievers rather than the rich,
yes,
even though that inherited money counts?
I would say, yes, the shakers and doers, the people who are doing things, really doing things, though. I mean, you know, the appearance of doing things is one thing, but I think people who are actually doing things, I think one of the obvious people would be Felix Rohatyn, for instance. Felix Rohatyn is a very serious man who had no intention of coming out into the limelight, but he, in a sense, was one of the keys to the nearer solutions that we have for New York City problems. Overnight, he became an instant celebrity. And that's understandable. That is the kind of celebrity we probably should have.
Is there any man or woman or couple who dominate the scene?
I don't think there's anybody who completely dominates. I think we're going to hear an awful lot about Elizabeth Taylor and John Warner for a while, only because they're in Washington and getting married. I think we're going to be dominated to a certain extent for a while by President-elect and Mrs. Carter. And that goes for Lillian and Amy and everybody else down there.
And how about the White House staff?
Yeah, well,
now that it's respectable again.
Well, again, we don't really know the details of the White House staff, but I think Jackie Kennedy will always be an influence in fashion one way or another. The fashion designers create. I mean, you know, whether you like it or not, Yves Saint Laurent decided people were going to look like peasants, and some people, you know, sheep, goats, whatever, lined up and went and dressed like peasants.
Where do people go now? I mean, part of your book is divided regionally as well. The watering places of the rich and aspiring rich and not very rich. And you quoted, I think, Elsa Maxwell referring in an earlier age, where they went, the world went. Does that hold true in a contemporary world, too?
No, the world was smaller then, most importantly, much smaller. It is so much larger now. The international, among other things, they didn't have jet planes. They had to take those poor darlings. They had to ride the Queen Mary. I feel so sorry for them. But it did take time to go and get somewhere and to create these places. Today, you can jet anywhere and you divide up. I mean, there's a somebody terribly chic in the group has gone to Latin America while somebody else is in Norway, while somebody else is in the Soviet Union, while somebody else, decided they'd go back and look at Cambodia or something.
Well, there still seems to be a great deal of mobility. Who are the globe-trotting all-stars now? Does it count? They're certainly written about.
Well, I think to a certain extent they're the children of the former all-stars in some cases.
They perpetuate.
Yeah, although I think what's interesting is that some of the children have actually rejected this life. Or if they have not rejected it, they're more quiet about it. They are not as exhibitionistic. And I think that the grand tour kind of thing is not, it's not chic to throw money off the back of trains these days. But you would have to name people like Halston. And Halston he'd laugh if he heard me say that in this context, because Halston, globe-trotting all-star, goes to his little house out in Southampton for a weekend, I mean, he's not off in Persepolis one day and then...
But it's the perception of his trotting, or anyone's perhaps, that is even more significant than what they really do.
Yeah, well, and also reality. I mean, if you deal with reality, the Cornelius Vanderbilt Whitneys still have 7 houses, 2 of which are maybe 3 houses, 2 or 3 in Spain and Portugal. I don't remember whether it's 3 in both or 2 in one or what, but there are plenty of houses. By the same token, they have, a couple of houses up and down this country: Saratoga, Adirondacks, Lexington, New York City, somewhere down south, and somewhere out west. Now, I would say that would still be the all-stars.
New York is the money capital as well as the social capital. Do people still have to come to New York to prove to themselves and to the world that they've made it both socially and financially?
The question of whether they have to do it or not is one thing, but they do it.
Do they?
They do it. I think certainly they do. They validate themselves by coming here. There's just no question that this goes on. This is one thing that is definitely not only not out of style, but that is always on the increase. Always on the increase. It is amazing to me. It is truly amazing, the people.
Well, what does New York do to certify them?
If it picks them up and circulates them around, of course the point is that until you get here, you don't really know that it's not that exciting after all, which is always, the grass is always greener kind of thing. But if it picks them up and circulates them around, that is the final validation. It accepts them. The hilarity being, of course, that anybody can be accepted in New York some way, shape, or form. It is the least closed society in America.
Well, how do they make it? Is it again a question of money and an organized thrust?
It's a question of money, but it's also a question of who you know. The point here would be is that you would not do it simply because you had friends in New York and just for the fun of it. You wouldn't do it because what you're doing is doing it to validate something you've done, which means this pile of money over hair curlers or whatever it is. And you come here to make this mark. So it rarely happens here without money. I suppose it's possible that some terribly nice person who lived here and was married, let's say, and went out west somewhere and whose husband and wife died, so that person comes back here and then becomes part of this. But I can't imagine it any other way. I mean, you just wouldn't just come here to play this incredible game.
The demands on aspiring hostesses have obviously changed considerably. I imagine in the past, I guess it's the reference to hair curlers, it was significant to go to the hairdresser and to read Vogue, and I assume that values and emphases have changed considerably, that now it is desirable not to go to the hairdresser and read Foreign Affairs. What is de rigueur now?
Well, I think you're quite right about Foreign Affairs. Well, as a matter of fact, of course I think you're right about the hairdresser. But I would say foreign policy rather than foreign affairs. I really think foreign affairs, while important sometimes, it puts me to sleep. Foreign policy does not put me to sleep. Foreign policy, I think, is more exciting and more interesting, and newer ideas. I have the feeling, yes, that is where it is today, and it's quite funny because that's about 2 years old. And you know who did that? You'll never get the credit for it, but it really was Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger made foreign policy chic.
Sexy.
Yes. Yes, he did. I mean, everybody had to know. It wasn't just
In the
a
event
question.
he sat next to at dinner?
Well, or that his entourage, or that you, in other words, Henry Kissinger is a star in his own right. And he really, you paid attention, because where was Henry going to go to dinner next? He did a very good job of changing. I mean, we are told that in American society today, between 3 and 10% care anything about foreign affairs. This is factual. 3 to 10% care anything about foreign affairs. And if it's closer to 10, Henry Kissinger did it.
People come and people go, and Mr. Kissinger is about to go, at least in the incarnation that we know him. What do you think will happen to his celebrity?
Well, you know, again, what springs to mind, what happened to Hubert Humphrey? Hubert Humphrey was vice president, and then he was no longer vice president. And he still is seen around the party circuit, remembered as the vice president. I would think that's what would happen to Henry Kissinger. You know, as always, there'll be a lot of people very happy to see Henry Kissinger go, to see him fall. But by the same token, there'll be an awful lot of people who will still have him to dinner. I think Henry Kissinger has a chance of lasting longer than many people, not only because of the kind of Secretary of State he was, but he has, the latest bid could be $2 million for his memoirs.
So the anticipation of, is perpetuated by the anticipation of reading those memoirs, or his potential newspaper column.
Well, yes, that too. I'd love it if he wrote a newspaper column. I think it'd be marvelous.
Well, do you plan to invite him to write on the op-ed page?
I have already invited him to write for the op-ed page.
And he's accepted?
No, he hasn't accepted, but one of these days he might. Let's hope he does. It would be marvelous if he would write for the op-ed page.
It may be his final opportunity to answer the right-hand column of the paper.
Yes, except that he, you know, he gets it really on all sides. He gets it from the liberals and from the conservatives.
Who else from the current Washington crowd do you think will endure? Who, in spite of that institution of the socially celebrated that changes from year to year, who will remain on this 1977 parade?
Well, you better watch Averell Harriman, I can tell you that. Averell Harriman's not going anywhere. And he's going to be here. We're all going to be dead, and Averell Harriman is still going to be up there on the head of the list. Certainly that's one person. I think that Clark Clifford, Paul Warnke, you know, all these people are going to be important.
In her splendid, interesting, and often entertaining new book, The Rich and Other Atrocities, Charlotte Curtis has said, who's a somebody depends on who's doing the choosing. My suggestion to you is to choose her book. Thank you very much, Charlotte Curtis, for being with us today. I'm Barbara Lee Diamonstein, and thank you, audience, for being with us.